What's up, everybody? This is Myles Turner, the Indiana Pacers. You're listening to the Paceroos Podcast. Be sure to follow @Paceroos on Twitter.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Paceroos Podcast, the only Australian NBA podcast with a bias towards the Indiana Pacers. My name's Adam, the host for this, the final episode for 2019 for the Paceroos Podcast. And we do have a treat for you. Our latest guest is a longtime Pacers journalist, freelance writer for Pacers.com, contributed to Pacers Sound. Every week you'll hear him on that podcast feed as well. Mark Montieth. Alex and I were lucky enough to sit down with Mark earlier today and discuss a range of topics. We went through the rotation without Victor Oladipo and what that rotation may look like with Victor Oladipo's return coming later in the month of January. We discussed TJ Leaf's struggles. We discussed the rotation overall and the pressures on an NBA player who may not be receiving the opportunities they would otherwise like to be getting. The potential for trade demands to come up as well. We talked about Myles Turner's recent social media hiatus and the concerns that Myles has expressed with his changing role, his recent interview with Vince Carter. If you haven't heard that, please check it out as well. We discussed the overall team's performance this season and how they may look down the stretch. We talked about the Sixers game that's, if it's happened, hopefully resulted in a great Pacers win to end the year. And we also went through Mark's favourite player to cover and favourite moment of the last decade of Pacers basketball. So it was a real pleasure to catch up with Mark Montieth and bring that to you as we finish the year. Just like to reiterate, for all of our listeners, for all our supporters, everyone who follows us on social media and has taken the time to listen to the show, provide feedback, whether it be constructive or positive, we really appreciate all of your ongoing support for a relatively new podcast still, only 20 episodes in, and we resolve to bring you an even better 2020 with more guests, more insights, more episodes, and some more fun to be had on the show in 2020, and hopefully a deep playoff run for the Indiana Pacers. So thank you to everyone for listening this year. Here's to a better 2020. Happy New Year. Be safe and enjoy the new year, everyone. And this is now the interview with Mark Montieth on the Paceroos Podcast. Welcome back to the Paceroos Podcast. We've been extremely lucky to have quite a few members of the Pacers Sound family on our show for over the last few months, including Jeremiah Johnson and Pat Boylan and Mark Boyle. We're now extremely privileged to have longtime journalist and an author and contributor to Pacers Sound as well, Mr. Mark Montieth on the podcast. Mark, thank you so much for joining the Paceroos, a couple of guys on the other side of the world.
Yeah, my pleasure, guys. Looking forward to it.
Brilliant. I want to start off with one of your most recent articles for Pacers.com around the second unit. You wrote specifically about Doug McDermott and TJ McConnell and their linkages to being coaches' sons. And we've seen that Nate McMillan over the last month or so has really settled on a core rotation of 9 guys. Unfortunately, someone like Eben Sumner only really gets opportunities at the moment when there's an injury like Malcolm Brogdon's recent injury. But do you see that 9-man rotation without Sumner, without Goga, being something that we see throughout the rest of the next month or so and into Victor Oladipo's return? And do you see that as a trend with coaches, that they pick their guys that they're comfortable with and they'll ride those guys and won't really make any changes unless absolutely necessary?
Yeah, I do. I think Nate prefers a 9-man rotation. Last year, he kind of half-jokingly said he had a 9.5-man rotation because he would play TJ Leaf, 5 or 6 minutes in the first half just to get him out there. And he's going with 9 this year, and that leaves out Leaf. It leaves out Sumner unless there's an injury. It leaves out Goga Bitadze, the first-round draft pick, which, I know fans like to see those guys, but that's his approach. And some coaches go with 8-man rotations, so you can't really be critical of it. Some coaches do go 10, and I hear from fans who want, a 10-man rotation. There's always the guy who's not playing who you think can help and you think might be better than somebody who is playing, and you want to see him out there. But going with a 9-man rotation is pretty standard in the NBA, and I do think it'll continue. And at some point, Oladipo is going to come back, and that's going to, I guess, drop somebody out of it. Or maybe that will force Nate McMillan's hand and cause him to go with a 10-man rotation. But I don't think it's going to change. It's hard to play it's hard to play 10, and you certainly can't play more than that and give guys any significant amount of minutes unless the game has become one-sided and you could just throw somebody out there in garbage time. So some of these guys who have shown promise just aren't likely to play very often this year.
Yeah, and we've seen recently Woj reporting that they think Oladipo is going to come back around that late January or maybe even early February time. So do you think that guys like McConnell or Aaron Holiday, we've seen them play, almost career years this year, but we think their minutes are going to get cut. Who do you see maybe not benefiting the most, but losing the most minutes? Maybe Sumner gets cut completely from the rotation, or do you see maybe Aaron Holiday taking a back seat on McConnell?
Yeah, I think it'll be kind of distributed, the cut in minutes. Certainly Jeremy Lamb goes back to the bench and his minutes will be reduced. And it'll affect, I think, Aaron Holiday and McConnell both. I do think McMillan will make a point of keeping those two guys in the rotation one way or the other. You can play Aaron Holiday at a two guard and you could even play McConnell with another point guard. So I think he'll find a way to keep him out there. It's just kind of hard to imagine that either Holiday or McConnell won't play at all in a game, although I suppose it's possible. But whenever the question is put to Nate McMillan, he says, we'll just deal with that when the time comes. And there's often an injury anyway, so he hasn't had to deal with it too much this year. But when Oladipo comes back, if there are no other injuries, something will have to give. And that will be interesting to see what it is. I guess I'm glad I don't have to make that decision, because I certainly wouldn't want to be the one to leave TJ McConnell on the bench and not play him, or same thing for Aaron Holiday. And Jeremy Lamb, will be the backup two guard. So if there are no other injuries, it's going to be there are going to be difficult decisions for Nate McMillan to make.
Yeah, you mentioned you wouldn't want that problem. It's also a nice problem to have, as you said, having that much depth in the rotation. And you mentioned earlier that we've already seen a few of the rotational players out of the rotation completely or playing spot minutes, like a Goga and a TJ Leaf and an Edmund Sumner. How difficult is it then, given your experience looking over NBA teams, specifically the Pacers, over this length of time, how difficult is it to balance, the expectations of those players for a coaching staff, and also to keep them hungry for when the opportunity comes? Because I can see the confidence waning, obviously, after they don't get played for a significant period of time. We saw that TJ Leaf did go a little bit dark on social media over the last month or so. That appears to have been a conscious decision on his behalf. And do you see it affecting these players dramatically, or do they just stay as professional as possible in the team environment and they just have to wait their turn?
Yeah, and it's difficult because, TJ Leaf was a first-round draft pick, and he has shown real promise at times. He's had some big games, such as the last game of the regular season a year ago when he scored 28 points against Atlanta. So I still contend he's a rotation player in the NBA when he's in the right situation. Some people consider him a bust. I don't. I'm not saying he's going to be a star, but I just think he's a solid player who can be in a rotation and do well. It requires communication. Certainly the coaches need to, they can't ignore the guy or shun him in any way. They got to be sensitive to his feelings about it and communicate with him, try to keep him up. Teammates have a role in that as well. I know, Leaf and Batadze and other guys who aren't in the rotation are respected members of the team. So I think their teammates try to keep them up. But at some point, it probably leads to a trade request. TJ Leaf isn't going to want to spend his career outside of the playing rotation. He's going to want to play at some point. So at some point, oftentimes something has to give and a trade has to be made. And I think in the case of this season, though, these guys can weather it. I think Batadze, as a rookie, isn't going to complain about anything. I think Leaf can handle the frustration. I don't see any outward signs of him becoming angry about it. I'm sure he's frustrated, which he should be, but I don't think he's going to develop a bad attitude or try to disrupt anything. He may ask for a trade before the trade deadline. Who knows? But I think for this year, at least, they can all get through this with a good attitude. And who knows, maybe injuries will require Leaf or somebody else to get an opportunity. But after this season, if nothing has been done, I would expect some changes to be made to get a guy like TJ Leaf a playing opportunity somewhere.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the injuries. I mean, we saw Edmund Sumner really take advantage of his opportunity early before he himself was injured. And then we saw TJ McConnell and Aaron Holiday really take advantage of their minutes in his absence. And he's kind of in no man's land at the moment. He's come back from injury. He's played a little bit with Malcolm Brogdon missing a couple of games recently. But it's got to be a little bit of an emotional roller coaster, even for a professional like Edmund Sumner. He's a guy that overcame a pretty significant injury prior to being drafted and has had a couple of injuries since. And he really looked like a player in those first few games. And in the minutes that he's had recently, he's shined particularly. He's racking up steals on the defensive end. He's gets out in transition. He's clearly a guy that's going to want to play, as you say. So do you see that also being an issue, that sort of logjam at the two guard in particular, moving forward with our very best two guard coming back?
Yes, I do. Something has to give. I mean, people may not remember this now, but there have been times, even at the beginning of this season, where Sumner was kind of regarded as ahead of Aaron Holiday in the rotation. He's taller, longer, a better defender. Holiday's a solid defender, but Sumner, I think, is a better defender, and he's added a three-point shot to his arsenal, so he's become a better offensive player. So Sumner's big challenge is to stay healthy, and he's had a hard time doing that so far, and only time will tell whether this is going to be an ongoing issue with him or if it's just some bad luck here early on. But he's another guy who something will have to give at some point. If he's not going to get the opportunity here, he's going to want an opportunity someplace else. And over the years, I've seen this happen with various players who they've proven they can play, but the opportunity isn't right here. And nobody wants to waste their career riding the bench or not playing at all. And it gets to the point where they would rather be a starter or rotation player on a bad team than not play on a good team. And that could happen with Sumner, with TJ Leaf, maybe with some others, but those two primarily, I think, are kind of caught in the middle of a logjam, and something will have to give at some point.
And we've talked a lot about, on this show in particular, about sacrificing minutes and players not necessarily getting the shots they want. And, it's been very well documented that Myles, he's gone through a couple of struggles this year, especially on offense. But how have you seen his growth? He was on Vince Carter's podcast. I'm not sure if you saw, but he was talking about how he struggled to play that 4 spot on offense, and it's a different role for him. It's almost like, he's back to square one playing the 4. But have you been impressed with how he's grown from game 1 of the season through to now? Because he seems to be starting to find his groove again.
Yeah, lately he's been good. Now, remember, game 1 of the season, he had a really good game. He had over 20 points, and remember, he and Sabonis combined really for their best outing of the year in that loss to Detroit in the opener. So at that moment, it looked like, oh, this is going to work out great. He and Sabonis playing together. And for whatever reason, Myles has gone through stretches where he seemed lost and wasn't getting anything done. He always said the right things about not caring about scoring, that he had shifted his emphasis to blocking shots and rebounding and, being a presence on defense and also being a 3-point threat. But I think, he wants to score. There's no question about it. And lately, as he's been scoring more, he's even said, hey, I'm a scorer, So it's been difficult to work him into the starting lineup and find a role that works for him and everyone else. I've always thought that most of the really good teams have a role player, a guy who doesn't need to score to be effective. It's hard to keep 5 guys involved offensively. If you look at previous Pacers teams, you think of a guy like Dale Davis or Jeff Foster, go back through almost anybody's championship team, there's probably one guy in the starting lineup who doesn't care about scoring that much and just kind of gets garbage points around the basket without being part of the offense. And it looked like Turner was going to be able to accept that role at one point, but it's not really who he is. He does want to score. So lately it seems to have worked pretty well. But to me, he still needs to develop a low post game. He can get 3-pointers and that's fine. But if he's going to be out there with Sabonis, the other team is going to put their center on Sabonis most likely. And if Turner has a smaller defender on him, a 6'8", power forward, so to speak. He needs to be able to take that guy to the basket and score on him. And he's doing that a little better. He still doesn't like to go to the basket. He likes to turn around and shoot. But he just needs to develop his post-up skills. And that's on him. He's had plenty of time to do that to this point. I see them working with him on it after practice, and I see him getting a little better. But to me, he really needs to focus on that. And if he can do that, if he can be a multiple offensive threat where he's not only a three-point shooter, but a guy who can take a smaller defender down to the block and score over him, then he's really good. And there will be nights when he'll get a lot of points. But if you do have a starting lineup of Brogdon, Oladipo, TJ Warren, Sabonis, and Turner, it's going to be really difficult to keep all five of those guys involved every night in the offense. Somebody's going to have to sacrifice on a game-to-game basis, depending on the matchups and depending on who has it going. And Turner, because he's standing out there at the three-point line, is going to be that guy a lot of nights, and he's going to have to accept that if that's going to be the basis of his offense, the three-point shot.
It's interesting you talk about Myles Turner. We had an episode a few weeks ago after Myles Turner turned off his Twitter and Instagram for a little while, and we made some comments regarding the criticism that he was receiving online. I think there's not probably a more maligned player on NBA Twitter or NBA Instagram in Pacers circles than Myles Turner. There's a very strong pro Myles and a very strong detractor of Myles' element. Do you see the criticisms of Myles, particularly around the rebounding numbers that he's put up, as a fair criticism? Because we sometimes see that people go completely overboard on social media, and maybe a wider comment from you on the age of social media and the connectivity that players have. And do you see that players are checking their mentions or checking their name, and they're more affected by the criticism because it's closer to them these days?
Yeah, I do think players are very sensitive to it, and I guess it was a good idea for Myles to get off of it, but he's back on it. And once he started playing well again, or I probably should say scoring more again, he got back on it. So he likes the engagement. Myles is a smart guy, the sophisticated guy, great parenting and all that, but emotionally, he's not the strongest guy. And you'd like for him, I think, to be a little less concerned what people are saying about him, and if anything, use that as a motivation. He does need to be a better rebounder. He's not going to get a lot of offensive rebounds when he's standing out on the perimeter. He's just not in the right position for it. But he could be better. I remember a couple seasons ago, he started playing more physically, and he let us know that one of his teammates had called him soft. He never did tell us who that teammate was. And I never did find out. I asked around a little bit, but that seemed to motivate him. And maybe that's what he needs now is, for a teammate to jab him a little bit. But it's not, his personality is different than Sabonis or some other guys, and you can't really change someone's personality. And it's okay. I mean, Rick Smits was kind of soft as a center. If you're not real strong, if you're just not an aggressive personality, it's going to show in your game, and you can't really criticize someone for that. So I don't fault him too much for that, but he does need to be as physical as he can be, and I think he's done okay as a rebounder. I think with Sabonis there, that takes some of the pressure off of him. It takes some of the opportunities away from him. I think people have felt like Turner should be like 18 points, 10 rebounds a game, but that's going to be really difficult with Sabonis next to him and with other scorers in the lineup. I think part of Turner's issue with fans, the reason he gets criticized, is number one, he was a high draft pick, came in with a lot of expectation, and then he showed a lot of promise early. His rookie year, I still remember the outcry for Turner to become a starter. He began the season injured, but then he started playing well. He had a 31-point game against Golden State, and there was this outcry for when's Turner going to start? And finally he did, and he played pretty well, and people were really optimistic about him. And then the first game of his second season, game against Dallas, he had 30 points and 16 rebounds. So again, everybody's thinking, Myles Turner's going to be great. And remember, Larry Bird told me once that he thought Myles could be the greatest Pacer ever. which is quite a statement. It surprised me, but he said it to me. And I don't know if he said that to motivate Myles or if he truly believed it or what, but all those things kind of combined to create great expectations for Myles Turner. And he hasn't really become that player. He seemed to have leveled off, certainly as a scorer. Leading the league in shot blocks last year was a great thing for him, and he was a good three-point shooter. But people are always going to want more. And when they see a guy who has shown hints of what he can do, they're going to want him to be more consistent. So I think you could fairly regard him as a bit of a disappointment, but you're going to have to accept who he is and find a way for him to fit into this particular starting lineup and be effective. And that's going to be primarily as a shot blocker and as a three-point threat who stretches the defense and who occasionally will get you points around the basket.
Yeah, it's obviously the points around the basket, and you mentioned the post-ups on a smaller player. The Pacers are lucky enough to have one of the best in the league at being able to get you 2 points against a smaller defender in Domas Sabonis. He's been tremendous this year as getting all-star buzz, and I'll ask your opinion about that at a later stage. But has Domas even exceeded your expectations and the expectations of the franchise? I mean, the franchise clearly thought he should have been a starter. They made the right moves or didn't bring Thaddeus Young back in the offseason to facilitate that move into the starting lineup. So do you think he's even exceeded everyone's expectations in how he's performed this year, or did everyone believe that he could be this, 20-point, 15 rebound a game type player?
Yeah, I would say he's exceeded expectations a little bit, not dramatically, because he showed what he could do off the bench last year. If you looked at the advanced analytics last year, he was really their second best player, or very arguably their best player as far as efficiency and things like that. So I'm not hugely surprised, but I'm a little surprised. I didn't think he would be this productive. Now, I didn't think Oladipo would be out this long either. And when Oladipo comes back, certainly that will probably impact Sabonis' scoring. But he's always going to get his rebounds. But he needs help. The Pacers are not a good rebounding team, a very poor rebounding team lately. And they need to rely on someone else besides Sabonis for that. But all in all, you cannot complain about him. I think he will probably be an all-star. I think if he maintains this, and if the Pacers continue on the path they're on as a team that surprises a lot of people with their record, I think Sabonis is very likely to be an all-star. He's not going to be a flashy all-star. He's not going to be the MVP of the all-star game, but I think he's deserving. So very valuable, and I think a small surprise on the whole, but not a huge one.
Well, the Pacers as a team, like you said, they've been a surprise packet along with the Miami Heat in the East, if you will. But I think this game against the 76ers coming up tomorrow is arguably one of the biggest ones of the season. Do you think the Pacers might have marked that one on the calendar, seeing as the way it ended in Philly? They probably should have won that game, had a couple of late turnovers. I know that Brogdon's going to be back. Do you think that's a massive test again for the Pacers, and do you see them wanting revenge after that loss in Philly?
Well, I think it's a big game for them. I don't really go along with the revenge because I think in the NBA you play so many games that if you have a difficult loss to somebody, by the time the next game comes around, so many other things have happened that it probably doesn't have a huge impact. But I'm sure the coaches will show the video of that game to the players and the way they fumbled it. They had the ball and the lead late in the game, and TJ Warren had a bad turnover and some other bad things happened. So that might be in their mind. But I think what's really the motivation for them in the game against Philly will be that they're coming off these two losses. You don't want to extend the losing streak to 3 games. They had a pretty good really an impressive performance in Miami on Friday, played very poorly in New Orleans on Saturday. And I think that more than anything will be what is the motivation for the game against Philly.
You are obviously the key to stopping Philly for the Pacers is stopping Joel Embiid, just as the key to stopping the Bucks has been stopping Giannis, and that's been something that most, if not all, teams in the NBA have struggled with. those are probably two of the worst matchups playoff-wise for the Pacers, in my opinion, just because of those two players and the fact that we don't anymore have a Thaddeus Young or even a Kyle O'Quinn coming off the bench to play spot minutes against a Joel Embiid. I mean, we're looking at a Goga potentially coming off the bench if the bigs get into foul trouble. Do you see there being any roster moves or any moves to try and address those deficiencies from a matchup perspective, or do you think Nate's just going to work on the system and work on the ability to be able to design the defense along with Dan Burke and Popeye Jones, etc., and Bano to counteract and neutralize those players as much as possible? Is it a personnel thing or is it a system fix?
Yeah, I think it's going to have to be a system thing. I would be surprised by a trade. They're certainly not going to give up on, Goga, and I think he is a guy who could be called upon in a game against Philadelphia for some minutes against an Embiid, because I think Goga's pretty physical. Nothing else, he can pick up a few fouls. And that's a game where I think Myles Turner has to have a bigger impact around the basket, because you're right, the Pacers have nobody who can match up with a guy like Embiid or somebody like Andre Drummond. Sabonis we think of as a big guy at 6'11", but he's outweighed by 30, sometimes 40 pounds by some of these centers he goes up against. And it shows. And Turner, if he's not playing around the basket, is going to not be in position to do it either. But I think they need to be really devoted toward rebounding and playing around the basket when they go up against a guy like Embiid. I think Bitadze can be called upon to help out as well. I don't think you can really address that through a roster move. If Bitadze develops over time, the time will come when something has to give with the bigs. If Bitadze proves himself someday as a starting caliber player, then something will have to give between him and Sabonis and Turner. And who knows what that would be. It would depend on what brings the most in return, I suppose. But for now, I think you stick with those three guys. I think you wait and see how things change when Oladipo comes back. I think you have to be careful not to make any drastic roster moves before Oladipo comes back and reestablishes himself, because that will change things pretty dramatically when he returns. Everybody will be adjusting their game a bit. He will take pressure off of certain people. He will take opportunity away from some people, but it'll be a much different team when he comes back. So I wouldn't expect anything major to happen in the way of personnel until he's back and until he's settled in and we get a better look at what this team can be with him.
And you mentioned there, Vic coming back, obviously having the ball in his hands a lot more. The main beneficiary, I guess, if you want to call it that, from Vic's absence, in my view, has been Malcolm Brogdon. He's had the ball in his hands more than he ever had it in Milwaukee. He's been scoring at a increasing rate. He's been distributing the ball magnificently. Do you think that Malcolm Brogdon, as it sits right now, is an all-star in the Eastern Conference? And do you see him being negatively impacted by Vic, or do you see the both of them complementing each other in the way that many Pacers fans hope and have the opinion that they're going to work together perfectly in that backcourt?
Yeah, I think he's a borderline all-star. It's one thing to say he's an all-star, but if you really break it down and look at the other point guards in the league, Kemba Walker's an all-star and Kyrie Irving probably. And if you start putting names down, it might be difficult to justify Brogdon being an all-star, but he's been really good. He's, been injury prone as he has been in previous seasons, and hopefully that doesn't continue throughout his time with the Pacers, but I think he's been really good. I think a lot of his value, though, is intangibles, and that's not what gets you on an all-star team. I think it'll be interesting what happens when Oladipo comes back. I think it's got a chance to be really good, and Brogdon has said all the right things about playing with Vic. At his introductory press conference over the summer, he talked about, hey, I want to be the guy who makes Vic an all-star. I'm here to make him better, that kind of thing. And I think Brogdon is willing to sacrifice. I don't think he's hung up on scoring. So I don't think that'll be an issue. And I think that the chemistry could be really good between them. They're different personalities. Brogdon is the guy they call the president. He's very serious in his approach to things and kind of quiet. He stays off social media. He's hard to find in the locker room after a game. He's always the last one to become available to the media, and by then a lot of times the media members have left. So he's low key in that regard. Whereas Oladipo, of course, is an entertainer who likes the attention, who wants to be a star, that kind of thing. And so I think it can work. If Brogdon was another guy who wanted to be a star and wanted a lot of attention, I think there could be some conflict there. That's why I think Oladipo paired well with Darren Collison, because Darren Collison had kind of a low-key demeanor as a point guard too. So I think it could work. They seem to get along very well. They spent some time over the summer, but we'll have to see. My thing with Oladipo, I've written it and said it many times. I haven't had a chance to talk to you guys, but he just has to limit his shot attempts. He can't be thinking he's going to get up 25, 30 shots in a game and the team will do well. You look back 2 seasons ago when he took 15 shots or fewer, the Pacers were 21-3. And those 3 losses were all kind of fluky. Something weird had to happen for them to lose those games. So they're practically unbeatable when he limits his shot attempts. And it was the same thing last season. They were on the same track last season when he was with the team. And then, of course, he had those 2 injuries and didn't play that much. But when he limits the shot attempts and kind of blends into the offense, they can be a really good team because he's an outstanding defender. He can get to the rim and create opportunities for teammates. He'll be able to kick out the ball to guys like T.J. Warren and Myles Turner for 3-pointers. And he's a closer. He's the guy you can go to at the end of a close game and make something happen. So he's an outstanding player, but he has to be careful not to be too hung up on scoring, not try to take over a game and try to score 30 points. And that's what I'm most curious to see is, will he blend in? And he saw last year, remember, he got hurt. He played early, got hurt, and came back. When he was out the first time before he came back, he saw how well the team did without him and how they barely missed a beat as far as their wins and losses without him. And he tried to adjust his style. He did try to back off a bit scoring, but it seemed to me like he didn't really like it, like he didn't really enjoy that type of role, that he wants to be a scorer. So now with this group, with even more scoring around him, he's really going to have to adjust. He can't be thinking he wants to score 25 points a game. So to me, that's the key to the rest of the season. Can everybody adjust to Oladipo's return? Can he adjust to his new teammates and make it a point to blend in? I believe his goal in games should be to go after a triple-double, not to try to get 25 or 30 points, but try to get a triple-double. Not that you can do that routinely, but he should be able to get 6 or 7 assists. He ought to be able to get his fair share of rebounds too. So to me, that's kind of the key after he returns, is that he blend in and they also make adjustments for him.
And do you think with the Pacers being through this in previous years, we know that obviously Paul George went through that devastating injury and even going way back to the early 2010s with Danny Granger missing a lot of time. Do you think going through those, major injuries and star players having to come back is going to help the franchise? I know Nate wasn't there he was there for the Paul George, but might not have been there for Danny. But do you think that going through that's going to help him and is going to allow them to allow Oladipo to be himself and not force anything? They're not rushing him back, but, do you see that being a help?
Yeah, I think it can help. I think Oladipo is really kind of on his own plan. The Pacers can't tell him when to come back. And some people might think that's wrong, but it's his body and his career, and you can't force somebody back. And he has emphasized over and over how patient he wants to be with this. And, I've personally wondered, why isn't he back? I see him out there practicing and scrimmaging, and he looks okay. It's not like he's limping around, but it's his body and his career, and he has to be the one to decide. And my experience over the years is that players are more likely to come back too soon from an injury than try to milk it, and be afraid to play when they're hurt. So I think we have no choice but to trust his judgment on it. And I think the Pacers know from experience you have to be patient in this kind of situation. You always have to take the long-term view. It's not just about this season for the Pacers. They are not likely to win a championship or be in the finals with Oladipo. This is about a long-term plan that these guys can grow together, and perhaps you can make other roster moves that improve the team a little bit. This is a step forward in a process and not the end result this particular season. So I think everybody's willing to be patient and see how it turns out. And they certainly have had, experience with Danny Granger and Paul George and different guys. And I think everybody in the league kind of has learned the hard way at some point that you have to be patient with this kind of thing and not rush anybody back too soon. I mean, you could argue that Oladipo came back too soon last year, and I don't know if that was strictly his decision or if he was encouraged to come back or what. But I think the fact that he came back last year and suffered that injury makes him all the more patient this year.
Yeah, well, obviously all Pacers fans and faithful hope he comes back 100%. But before we wrap up the show, I've got to ask, with the decade wrapping up tomorrow against the 76ers, do you have maybe a favorite game or favorite moment since covering the Pacers since 2010 to today?
Yeah, I would say off the top of my head, the favorite game would be when they closed out the Knicks in 2013 in the second round of the playoffs. That was, for one thing, the Pacers' greatest moments always seem to come on the road. Like in the ABA, they won their championships on the road, and Reggie Miller's great moments came on the road for the most part. That was a great playoff moment that happened at home, and they closed out the Knicks, and the Knicks had been a great rival, of course, going back to the 1990s. And in that series, it was a 6-game series, and every Pacer starter was the leading scorer in one game that series. And I forget, somebody was the leading scorer in 2 games, of course, but everybody in that starting lineup had been the leading scorer in one of the games. And in the post-game press conference, all 5 starters came in together. They usually bring in one player, the star player, maybe 2 after a playoff game, but all 5 came in, and it seemed to really exemplify what that team was about, because that was a very balanced team. With George Hill, Lance Stevenson, Paul George, David West, and Roy Hibbert. That was a good team, and it was a balanced team. And so to me, I guess I would say that was the highlight. That game, was kind of the peak moment for that particular team.
And being around the team as much as you are, especially over the last 10 years, we look to the decade, who's been your favorite player to cover, to interview, to speak with? Who's been your favorite player to interact with over the last 10 years?
Yeah, that's a tough one because most of them are good. It's rare to find a guy who isn't comfortable to talk with. Certainly some guys are withdrawn by nature and don't like to talk a lot. But I would say if I had to pick one over the last 10 years, I'd probably go David West. And he was an introverted personality, but he was always willing to stand up and address a question, win or lose, and he would say something meaningful. David's a really sophisticated guy and always had something to say. And was just, you always like the guys that you can go to after a loss and get something relevant to the game. And I guess for me, that was David West. I used to have a radio show, like an hour-long conversation with people, and David West was a guest of mine once. And, you could talk to David about a lot of different things. And he's just a guy you can look up to. T.J. Warren, as you probably know, is David West is his mentor, basically. T.J. Warren played for David West's AAU team in North Carolina. And David has had a profound impact on T.J. Warren's career. So I think as that kind of guy, as that kind of mature leader, David West was always somebody you wanted to talk with. So I'd probably go there. But there have been a lot of guys, who have been really good to talk to. Some guys have a better sense of humor than others. Some guys, are more willing to talk longer than others. Some guys, want to get out of it as quickly as possible. But as far as a guy who gave you direct answers to questions, I'd go with David West.
And that's a really good way to finish the decade. We couldn't be more excited for the Sixers game tomorrow. I know that it's one that we've been talking about on the show for a little while, and we hope that the Pacers can overcome the last 2 losses and finish the decade with a win. Mark, it's been a pleasure and a joy to have you on the podcast. We've been a fan for a while and listening to you on Pacers Sound and reading you on Pacers.com, among other places. You did mention your book, which for Australian fans can be had on Amazon. Would you like to give that a brief plug?
Yeah, I wrote a book a couple years ago. It's called Reborn: The Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis. And it's about how the Pacer franchise came to be and how it got off the ground. The Pacers were a member of the American Basketball Association in 1967. Really, well, they were very fortunate. They were lucky to get off the ground the way they did. They got one of their Hall of Fame players, Roger Brown, out of a factory. They got Slick Leonard, their Hall of Fame coach, up the road in another city. He was selling school supplies. So they were really lucky to get off the ground, and a lot of things had to come together. So I focused on how the franchise got started in the first place and how it got established in its first 2 seasons. A lot of people don't know, but Indianapolis had an NBA franchise at the very beginning of the NBA in the early 50s. There was a team called the Olympians that were really doing well here, and they got broken up by a scandal related to college point shaving. And so there was a 14-year period where there was no pro basketball in Indianapolis. And then the Pacers brought that back in 1967. So I give the background, talk about all the things that had to happen for the franchise to get started, and all the things that had to happen for it to get off the ground and, cause the city to fall in love with it. And I think people will enjoy it. I think if you have any interest in basketball at all, you'll find it to be of interest. And I get into the biographical information of a lot of the players, including guys like Mel Daniels and Roger Brown, who are Hall of Famers, but also other players that people might not be aware of. There's just a lot of great stories in those early ABA years of players taking a gun on a road trip, for example, things you couldn't get away with today, to say the least. So I feel good about it. People can look at the review comments on Amazon. Again, it's called Reborn: The Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. And as I said, for Australian fans, I know there's a lot of Australian Pacers fans that listen to the show, as well as local Indianapolis natives. That book can be found on Amazon, and for Australian fans, you can get it on Kindle. So as soon as you listen to this episode, head to Amazon and give it a listen. Mark, it's been an absolute joy and a pleasure. Good luck with the rest of the season, and thank you so much for being a part of the Paceroos.
Hey, I enjoyed it. Always love talking with the fans in other countries. So be happy to join you anytime.